Fulani Bandits, identified as herdsmen terrorists, have allegedly taken control of forests across Igboland, occupying strategic locations and waiting for a directive from higher authorities in the north to launch violent attacks on eastern communities. The situation is reportedly more serious than previous violence in Benue State, and many in the region fear an impending large-scale coordinated assault, especially now that Nnamdi Kanu is still in detention and allegedly betrayed by some insiders. A critic warns that the threat is no longer a rumor, but a real and present danger, urging every individual not to think they are safe or immune to what is coming. A man claims he had a prophetic dream or vision around 2:30 a.m., seeing clearly that the forests are filled with armed Fulani bandits, posing as kidnappers or hiding in religious locations like the Zion Ministry site in Enugu State, waiting for the signal to strike. The vision allegedly showed targets such as schools, hotels, churches and markets, which the critic says are the main focus of the planned attacks, warning that government security forces cannot be trusted. He strongly accuses Nigerian security agencies and the government of being complicit, stating that they will likely vacate those areas the moment the attacks begin, and that the Fulani Bandits are government-sponsored. Communities are urged to stop relying on divine intervention alone, and instead physically equip their youths to form local defense teams, because God will not fight drones and bullets with bare hands. An example is given of a northern local government area where citizens received advance intelligence of a planned attack, mobilized collectively, and successfully repelled the bandits with self-defense. Wealthy individuals, especially billionaires from the eastern region, are being called upon to fund and supply community defense forces instead of waiting for political solutions. The critic ends with a warning that the 2027 elections and government promises are false distractions, and that the real mission of these alleged attacks is to destabilize the region and keep citizens too frightened to challenge economic or political oppression. The story unfolding in the southeastern part of Nigeria, commonly referred to as Igboland, is not just a security concern. It is a deeply troubling development that is stirring a heavy mix of fear, urgency, mistrust, and a call for action. What many had once whispered about in quiet conversations and backdoor meetings is now echoing through the towns, forests, streets, and churches of the East. A possible coordinated threat to their land, their lives, and their legacy. The alleged seizure of forest regions by heavily armed Fulani herdsmen, identified by many in the region as bandits or terrorists, has added fuel to a growing fire of distrust toward the Nigerian government and its security agencies. The implications are far-reaching and too disturbing to be ignored any longer. According to several reports and testimonies coming out of Igboland, Fulani bandits have not just appeared in random places or acted as disorganized criminals. They have allegedly taken over strategic forest regions across Enugu State, Ebonyi State, Imo State, Abia State, and Anambra State. These regions are not only dense and difficult to monitor, but also serve as natural hiding places for anyone planning covert operations or large-scale violence. A man, whose name has not been revealed for security reasons, claimed he had a disturbing dream or vision in the early hours of the morning, around 2:30 a.m. In his words, he saw forests filled with armed Fulani herdsmen posing as kidnappers and also disguising themselves in religious locations, including a popular spiritual center known as the Zion Ministry site, located in Enugu State. The vision, he said, was very clear. Churches, schools, markets, and hotels were the primary targets of these planned attacks. What was most chilling about this testimony was not just the spiritual tone of it, but the detailed alignment it had with actual fears already circulating among locals. People are not just afraid of another round of sporadic violence. They are now convinced that something bigger is brewing, and that the delay in its execution is only because the signal has not yet been given. And who is expected to give that signal? That is where the situation becomes even more complex. According to various outspoken critics and observers in the East, the Fulani herdsmen are not acting alone. They believe strongly that these bandits are government-sponsored and strategically positioned to carry out a calculated operation once a directive comes from the north, possibly from certain political or military interests. The forest regions of Nigeria have often served as hotbeds for criminal activity. But what is different now, many say, is the level of coordination and the pattern of silence coming from the government. Several critics argue that there is little to no genuine effort to root out these alleged bandits, especially in Igbo territories. In fact, some believe the silence is not just neglect, but complicity. One critic went as far as saying that once the attacks begin, the Nigerian police and military forces currently stationed around these forest areas will simply withdraw or disappear, leaving the communities wide open for slaughter. According to this line of thought, the Fulani herdsmen are not just wandering criminals, but a weaponized population used for political domination, land seizure, and regional destabilization. Such claims may sound exaggerated to an outsider, but to those who have seen the slow rise of attacks, the killings in Benue State, the kidnapping crisis in Niger State, and the seemingly endless attacks in southern Kaduna, there is a sense that history is repeating itself. Only this time, it is coming home to Igboland. The difference, however, is that many people are no longer willing to sit back and wait for divine intervention or political promises. There is an awakening happening across Eastern communities. People are beginning to understand that survival may no longer depend on prayer alone, but on action. A growing number of voices are calling for local defense initiatives to be formed in every town and village. These are not just suggestions made out of panic, but informed by recent success stories. In one part of the north, a local government area reportedly received advance warning of a planned attack. Rather than wait for the military to arrive or hope the attackers would change their minds, the community came together, mobilized its youth, and repelled the bandits using locally crafted defense methods. It was a classic example of self-preservation born out of unity and urgency. This success story has become a reference point for many community leaders, youth groups, and civil society organizations in the East. They are beginning to ask questions about the role of wealthy Easterners, particularly billionaires who have the financial means to supply and equip community defense teams. Critics argue that instead of building political networks in Abuja or investing in real estate in Lagos, these Eastern billionaires should be using their wealth to protect their ancestral lands. The message is simple. If these communities fall, your money will not matter. Religious institutions, too, are being called upon to shift their focus slightly. While no one denies the power of prayer or the need for spiritual strength, people are now saying that even in the Bible, David used a sling and a stone to confront Goliath. In modern times, slings and stones are not enough against automatic weapons, drones, and coordinated assaults. The belief is growing that faith without action is dangerous in such a volatile context. Communities are being encouraged to train their young men and women, teach them surveillance skills, first aid, basic arms handling, and community intelligence sharing. Churches and pastors are being told to become part of the solution, not just the spiritual sanctuary. The situation also shines a light on the ongoing detention of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra. Many in the East believe that the timing of these threats is not a coincidence. With Mazi Nnamdi Kanu still in the custody of the Department of State Services in Abuja, and with his voice somewhat limited, communities feel exposed and unprotected. Some insiders are even accused of betraying him by allegedly feeding false hopes to the public while secretly working with those who want him silenced permanently. This betrayal has deepened the mistrust people now feel toward political elites and federal authorities. For many Igbo people, the feeling of abandonment is no longer a theory but a lived experience. They recall how, during past crises, security agencies either failed to intervene or came long after the damage had been done. Now, with fresh warnings coming in the form of visions, leaked reports, and strange movements within forested areas, the fear is turning into anger. There is a sense of urgency among the elderly and the youth alike. No one wants to live through another genocide or mass slaughter. The memory of the Nigerian Civil War and the suffering that followed still haunts the land. What is happening now, they say, is too similar to those events to be ignored. As the 2027 general elections slowly approach, critics are warning that the entire process is a distraction. According to them, the promise of future elections and economic programs is just a tool used by political actors to keep the masses docile. The real objective, they argue, is to destabilize Igboland, render it ungovernable, and eventually justify military occupation or a federal state of emergency. If that happens, they warn, land can be seized, movements restricted, and voices silenced, all in the name of national security. This theory, whether true or exaggerated, has found a strong following among young people in the East who already feel alienated by the political process. The critics insist that the time to act is now. Waiting for external help, whether from Abuja or the international community, is no longer an option. The call is for each community to begin identifying vulnerable spots, such as schools, churches, open markets, and remote villages. These should be fortified, monitored, and guarded, not just during the day, but especially at night. Drones, surveillance cameras, whistles, bells, walkie-talkies, and emergency sirens are among the tools being suggested. The idea is not to form militias or break the law, but to become so organized and alert that any incoming threat can be detected and confronted early. Some young people are already responding to the call. In parts of Imo State and Anambra State, local groups have started holding town hall meetings, forming WhatsApp groups for security alerts, and training volunteers in basic self-defense. These groups are not perfect, and they often lack the kind of funding and equipment that would make a big difference, but they are a sign of hope in a season of uncertainty. Women are also getting involved, offering to cook for volunteers, help with intelligence gathering, and pray in groups while others patrol. The elders in some communities have begun recalling stories from the Civil War era, warning that those who ignore history are bound to repeat it. They talk about how little signs were ignored back then until war broke out, and how millions died simply because they hoped that things would get better. Today, those same elders are urging their children and grandchildren not to be naive. The enemy, they say, is no longer far away. It is inside the forests, inside the bushes, possibly even inside some homes disguised as neighbors. This situation is no longer just about security. It is about identity, survival, and the right of a people to live without fear in their ancestral land. It is about whether or not the Nigerian state can be trusted to protect all its citizens equally. And most of all, it is about whether the Igbo people will once again find themselves at the receiving end of history's cruelty, or whether they will rise, organize and defend what is left of their dignity, land and heritage. No one knows exactly when or if the so-called signal will come. But what everyone agrees on now is that pretending everything is fine is the greatest danger of all. The forests are no longer just part of nature. They have become the stage for a brewing conflict, one that may soon break into the open if nothing is done. The time for empty promises is over. The time for action is now. And in the heart of Igboland, the question on everyone's mind is no longer if the attack will come, but when. As dawn breaks each morning across the serene towns and rolling farmlands of Igboland, there is a strange and unsettling silence hanging in the air. What used to be a region filled with morning songs from the birds, the sounds of children on their way to school, and farmers calling out to one another in the fields, has now been replaced by hushed whispers and cautious glances toward the forests. The heart of Igboland beats slower these days, not out of peace, but out of an eerie stillness brought on by the fear that something terrible is coming. And for many, that terrible thing is no longer a possibility. It is an inevitability. The reports that Fulani herdsmen, often referred to as bandits by the local population, have taken over forests across the region are no longer treated as rumor. From Nsukka in Enugu State to Orlu in Imo State, from the hinterlands of Abakaliki in Ebonyi State to the vast farmlands around Umuneochi in Abia State, strange figures have been seen entering and leaving forest zones, mostly at night, carrying weapons, setting up camps, and reportedly even interacting with locals under false pretenses. In some cases, they disguise themselves as nomadic cattle rearers. In other situations, they dress as religious pilgrims or seekers of spiritual healing, blending into the many revival ministries and churches scattered across rural Igbo communities. There is a growing belief among villagers and local observers that these Fulani fighters are not acting independently but are receiving logistical support, arms, intelligence, and possibly financial aid from powerful northern interests. Many point to the patterns observed in places like southern Kaduna and Benue State, where herdsmen started by entering quietly, often asking to buy food or requesting permission to graze, and then eventually launched surprise attacks, burning villages, killing innocent people, and displacing thousands. The similarities in behavior and tactics have led many to fear that the same script is about to play out again, this time in Igboland. One particular element of this rising fear is the belief that Nigerian government forces will not stop the bandits. In fact, some community leaders believe the federal security agencies are working hand in hand with the invaders. They cite situations where intelligence was passed to the police or army about unusual gatherings in the forests, but no action was taken. In other cases, locals have said that after security personnel visited certain areas for brief inspections, the very next night attacks or kidnappings occurred in those same locations, as though someone had passed along insider information. This has led to deep suspicion and loss of trust in federal authorities, with many saying that if the security agencies were truly independent, these bandits would not have been allowed to entrench themselves so deeply. The most horrifying part of the alleged plan is the targets: churches, markets, schools, and hotels. These are not military targets or political centers. These are places filled with civilians, places where people gather in joy and peace, and places that represent community life in Igboland. The strategy, it seems, is not just to kill, but to instill widespread fear, to disrupt daily life, and to paralyze the economic and social engine of the region. One critic argued passionately that the goal is to break the spirit of the people, to turn proud, self-sufficient communities into frightened, dependent and silent towns, too traumatized to demand their rights or defend their land. Many people in the East have now started referring to the forests not as natural landmarks, but as death traps. Families that once sent their children to fetch firewood or tend to goats in the bush now keep them indoors. Hunters have stopped going into the deeper forest areas. Farmers are abandoning vast plots of fertile land because of strange movements and repeated reports of gunshots, usually heard in the middle of the night. In one town in Anambra State, the entire local farming cooperative has collapsed because of fear. With food production being disrupted, prices of staple crops like yam, cassava and vegetables are starting to rise, threatening both food security and economic stability. In the midst of this rising crisis, the silence from the federal government is deafening. There have been no official statements addressing the fears of the Easterners, no federal deployments to investigate or flush out suspected bandits from these forest zones, and no attempt to reassure the people that their safety is a national priority. Instead, attention continues to be focused on political calculations toward the 2027 elections, leaving many Igbo people feeling as though their survival is not part of the larger national agenda. They see the indifference as a strategy, what one elder described as a slow-motion extermination hidden behind bureaucracy. Religious leaders are starting to speak out, albeit carefully. Some pastors and bishops have begun to warn their congregations during Sunday services to stay alert, to report suspicious movements, and not to rely solely on prayers. There have been midnight prayer vigils, fasting programs, and spiritual warfare declarations. But there is now a growing chorus among even the clergy that prayers must be backed with preparation. One pastor in Enugu State, who spoke on condition of anonymity, told his congregation that while God protected the Israelites in the Bible, they also had to defend themselves. He reminded them that when the walls of Jerusalem were being rebuilt, the workers carried swords in one hand and bricks in the other. A lesson, he said, Igbo people must learn quickly if they are to survive what is coming. Community elders, too, are organizing. In villages across Imo and Abia states, town unions have started holding emergency meetings, discussing how to gather funds to purchase surveillance equipment, train local security volunteers, and organize neighborhood patrols. There is no central command structure yet, but the energy on the ground is building fast. People want to protect themselves. They are no longer waiting for help from a federal system they believe is broken, biased, and possibly hostile to their survival. Interestingly, some young people have begun looking for ways to use technology to aid this movement. Groups of tech-savvy individuals in towns like Auka, Newi, and Aba have begun designing mobile apps and WhatsApp alert systems where villagers can report suspicious movements instantly, triggering rapid response from volunteers in neighboring communities. The digital infrastructure is still young and not widely adopted, but it represents a new frontier in grassroots defense, a way for Igbo communities to reclaim their agency in the face of state indifference. On social media, a wave of activism is taking hold. Influencers, civil rights advocates, and diaspora Igbo groups are using hashtags, videos, and documentaries to raise global awareness. They are sending letters to the United Nations, the African Union, and foreign embassies in Nigeria, asking them to investigate and speak out against what they describe as a creeping genocide in slow motion. These online movements are not just for attention. They are driven by a sense of urgency that something terrible is about to happen, and that silence will make the world complicit. But even as fear and readiness rise, not everyone is convinced that local defense alone can work. Some argue that the regional governments in the East must rise to the occasion. They criticize the governors of the 5 southeastern states, Ebonyi, Enugu, Imo, Abia, and Anambra, for failing to form a united security front. This is the end of our news update. Please click the icon on the top right corner of your screen to watch my next video. You will enjoy it. I will see you again in my next update. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.